Good morning. I'm Bob Stagito, and I'm hosting a little informal chat with Dawn Lester and David Parker, who are the authors of the book. It has a lot of words, I have to read it. What Really Makes You Ill, Why Everything You Thought You Knew About Disease is Wrong. A great book, over 800 pages, and definitely the Bible of health, and something that everyone should get a copy of. And my copy is a Kindle copy so that I can search through it. So I can't hold it up, but I'm sure David and Dawn have a copy they can hold up, and they can give you a little bit more of their background, who they are, and how they got to where they are. So take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, Bob, and thank you for having us on this chat. It's much appreciated and very much needed for people like ourselves, yourself and us, to try and cut through some of the misinformation that's been put around the internet, not only on the complete nonsense about the coronavirus, but also about what is really healthy and what disease is all about. Hence, as you say, I'll hold it up again, while we wrote the book with a sort of challenging title. As people can see, it's quite a tome. And there are 40 pages of references in there, so people can check out where our research has come from. This is not just our opinions. This is based on the literature. It's not just internet searching. It's based on literature from doctors and scientists and researchers, probably over the last 150 years up to present day. So there's a lot of information there for people. And it was, as they say, quite a journey for us, because we started out from the position of thinking that the medical establishment was based on science, and that everything they said was true. Everything from what causes diseases, which is, as they told us, bacteria and viruses, to the fact that vaccinations were good for you and built up the body's immunity system. You know, we believed all that until we started researching it, and then realized that, as we say, nothing could be further from the truth. And it was hence it took us 10 years to put all this information together. So right back, we decided to start with the most basic questions of what really makes you ill, and which brought into question the whole germ theory, which we found to be completely flawed and not the basis of what makes you ill at all. So that's what got us going.
That's great. And you have a bunch of points you want to cover here, so I'd like you to start. I think the first one is why there's no scientific proof that either bacteria or so-called viruses cause any disease. So take that one away.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, when we sort of decided we'd ask the most basic question of what really makes you ill, obviously that meant that we'd got to look at what doctors and the medical establishment said made you ill. They attributed the vast majority of diseases to being caused by either bacteria or viruses. So we started with bacteria, and soon found that, you know, going back to sort of Louis Pasteur's time, when the germ theory sort of came into being, and I know he's sort of attributed as the grandfather of it, although people were talking about it before him, but it really based back to where they were looking to see what made people ill, and with just optical microscopes, which is all they had at the time, looked into the blood and could see bacteria, which are living things. And because whenever they saw dead or dying cells within a person, let's say, and around those dead and dying cells, there were clusters of bacteria. So they made the big fundamental mistake of blaming the bacteria for causing the dead and dying cells, and that's really where it started. Rather, as we found out after much research, that that's quite the opposite. The bacteria are cleanup agents, very vital to the body, and are actually digesting, if you like, and cleaning up the dead and dying tissue. They're not the cause of it. So in a nutshell, that was the first fundamental mistake that the early pioneers, if you like, doctors looking through optical microscopes, is what they saw. So we investigated if there were actually any diseases that could be definitely attributed to bacteria, and found that there were none. There were always much more plausible reasons as to why people got ill. And we found the same And I'm cutting a long story very short here, otherwise we'll be here a long time. And we found the same thing with so-called viruses, a little bit more complex, that story, because they couldn't at that time see these things. They didn't know. They assumed that there was something else other than bacteria, but they didn't know what it was because they couldn't see it. Their optical microscopes were not powerful enough. Then in the 1930s, when the electron microscope was invented, they could see much smaller things. And then they saw these other particles, which they named, a misnomer really. They got the name viruses, which, as people may know, comes from the Latin, which means poison or toxic substance in its original form. So it's a bit of a misnomer really to call these particles in the blood viruses, but that's what stuck with them. And then they started attributing all sorts of other diseases to these particles, which I'd rather call them particles rather than viruses. But as we found, there was actually no scientific evidence to back that up, either then or to this day. You know, there are basic tests that need to be done to prove whether one of these particles, bearing in mind that bacteria are alive, but these particles are not and have never been alive. They're really cellular debris, particles of the cell when it breaks up. So that's the first mystery, is how the doctors could attribute so much illness to something that's not alive. It's just a piece of protein, really. But sure enough, that's what they've done. And I liked one of your analogies, Bob, actually, when you sort of explained it, a cell breakup, a bit like dropping a pane of glass on the floor and it smashes into hundreds of pieces. But then the virologists start looking at all the individual pieces and giving them special names and trying to attribute various properties to them as to what they may or may not do. And it's a good analogy, I think, because that's what they've done. And some they've given them all sorts of names, even exosomes, which we may talk about a bit later. But this is really just cellular debris, and there's no scientific proof ever then or now that has been able to prove that any of these bits of cellular debris do anything at all.
One of the problems is that they attribute cell death as being something to do with disease. But of course, cell death is something that happens all the time. I mean, millions of cells die every day. That's part of the normal process. I mean, that's why it's well known that various organs are completely renewed every some months, some years, and that only happens because there are new cells being created, developed throughout the body all the time. So that's another kind of fairly fundamental mistake, that the death of cells equals disease. So in the laboratory experiments, when they've got all their different chemicals and bits and pieces and bacteria and whatever other particles they're looking at, when they see that something, when they see that cells die, they've assumed, again wrongly, that it's the actual particles or the bacteria that have caused that cell death, and that actually is disease. But nowhere, and we kept looking, but we couldn't find anything where there's any evidence that those that cellular death or that any of these other particles or bacteria can be proven to cause certain symptoms. So, you know, why these particular particles cause people to have a fever, or people to have a cough, or people to have, you know, vomiting and diarrhea. They associate the bacteria, certainly many bacteria, with diarrhea, you know, those sorts of digestive problems. But they don't explain how those bacteria actually produce those effects. They just say, well, they cause it because they find them in whatever's been expelled from the body. So it's the, you know, mistaking an effect for a cause, and that's what's happened all the way through. So, you know, as we said, we kept looking for all kinds of evidence that said, you know, the original papers that said, yes, this particular particle has been isolated or purified, you know, because there are various different interpretations of the word isolation, you know, and to have gone through the actual processes of making it absolutely clear that they are the cause, and there is just no evidence that they have been shown to be the cause. I mean, we can talk about all the various experiments that were done a century ago, when, you know, during the so-called 1918 or Spanish flu. Lots of experiments were performed where they were trying to get sick people to transfer their germs to healthy people. And no matter, you know, the various experiments were performed, and, you know, the healthy people, no matter how much they were coughed at and sneezed at and everything else, it's fairly revolting if you look at the experiments, but they didn't, you know, they didn't become ill. So that's a big, it might not be a laboratory experiment, but it's certainly a good indication that the theory ought to have been looked at. But no, 100 years later, and nobody's ever questioned that, and that's all sort of brushed aside. Oh, well, you know, they call, you know, that they create all sorts of other situations or explanations, you know, like asymptomatic carriers and those kinds of things. But they can make all kinds of explanations and ideas and theories, but there is no actual evidence that that is the case, which is why we make that statement.
And we were always very surprised, particularly with viruses, because, and it's very pertinent to obviously what's happening with all this COVID nonsense at the moment. We were really surprised because the tests to sort of determine if one of these particles that they call in a virus is actually responsible for illness are relatively straightforward. You know, they basically breaks into sort of three parts, that they should purify it. I know, as Dawn has sort of said, there's quite a few people at the moment sort of saying, oh, I've seen a paper that says they've purified. No, not purified. They've isolated. And as we find that when you look at those papers, they've not isolated anything. They use what we call weasel words. You know, it's like in their things when they're producing vaccines or medicines, and they call it safe. Now, to normal people, safe means exactly that, safe. Not, it only kills probably 30% of the mice that we try it out on. Well, that's not safe, but that's the way they work. So if it only kills a small percentage of the test rodents, then they'll put it out as safe. Well, so it's very misleading. And they've done the same with isolation. And when you look at it, they've not isolated it, and they certainly have not purified it. And they're always very careful not to use that word because it's much more exacting. So the things they should do is purify the so-called virus, and then fully categorize its makeup.
Right.
And then once they've done that, they should be able to take that viral particle and introduce it into a healthy person and produce the disease which they say it causes. And those are the three steps. And none of those steps have ever been done for any virus, which is really, really surprising. And that includes this present so-called coronavirus. And, you know, you think, well, how can you shut the world down, which effectively is what they've done, and you can't produce the evidence? And we know, because we've seen a few papers in this country where people have written to the government under the Freedom of Information Act and asked those questions. Well, where is the evidence? And we've seen the documents come back from the government saying, oh, we're not in possession of that information, which you think, well, how can you not be? And the same thing happened in New Zealand. Someone wrote there to the government and they got the same answer back. We're not in possession of that information. So it's a complete outrage that governments are closing countries down and then openly admit, when pressed, that they don't have the information that said, yes, the tests have been done and this virus has proved to cause the disease. So people should be very wary of this and realize that it's a complete nonsense for this present virus. But the same facts, or lack of them, is the same for every virus. You know, we looked at a lot of them, and we're not the only ones that have looked. So it's not something special to us. Some great pioneers, and I'm thinking of Kary Mullis, for instance, who got a Nobel Prize for the PCR test, which again is being misused at this very moment. And against what he said, I mean, unfortunately, he died last year. And he said all along, this is not what this test is designed for. And he's the inventor of it. And he said, this is not what this test is designed for testing in this way for HIV at the time.
Yeah, I would add to that because of that test, they're saying so many cases are on the rise. And basically, there are no cases because, as you were saying, they're testing for something. They haven't. Most people think when they do the test, they're finding the virus in people, but they're not. So this whole testing thing is totally bogus. Where they say it has a high false positive. What my mind just went blank. False positive. That's it. Anyway, high false positive rate. Well, it's completely false positive. It's false negative, false positive. It has no value at all because it's not actually isolate. It's not actually detecting the presence of the virus in people.
There were two. I think there were two types of tests. One is the PCR test, which is well, it amplifies genetic material. So it's a question of the genetic material, not the actual full virus anyway. And the other test is what's called the antibody test, and that's a whole other can of worms, or what antibodies are, because antibodies are proteins that are claimed to be specific to a particular so-called virus, but because the virus, or the particle called a virus, and let's keep it real here because it's not a virus, but the particle called a virus is it has never been purified, so they don't know its characteristics, so they don't know what proteins are specific to it. So looking for proteins that they call antibodies, it's, as you say, it's all bogus because it's meaningless because they're not looking for something that has ever been identified, and it's as simple as that. And so any positive tests, as you say, completely meaningless. There are no cases because there is no virus that anyone has ever been found to have in their body, or there is no virus that causes any disease. So we're not denying people are maybe ill and even dying, but it's got nothing to do with this so-called particle called a virus. Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things that we must state clearly. We're not denying that people are ill and some are dying, but there are definite causes, and they are not to do with this particle.
Absolutely.
I mean, it would seem to be common sense, really, for any test that they claim to do as regards illnesses supposedly caused by viruses, any virus. As we've just said, they never, and as you said, Bob, they never actually test that the virus is present in that person's body. And you have to ask yourself why. If you're saying that a particular virus is causing the illness that this person has got, why can't you take a blood sample and check that the virus is present in their body? So, I mean, that really should sound alarm bells to people because they never do that. They've never done it. So they do this, as Don said, these proteins, which they're calling markers, and they did this with all HIV as well, and said, well, if these proteins, and let's call them that, keep it simple, if these proteins are present, then it's a marker that indicates you've got the virus. And I'd say, well, no, you check and see whether the virus is there, never mind about something that's a marker. And as people have pointed out with the HIV test, when they said, oh, these markers are there, so therefore you're HIV positive, people have realized that these same proteins are present in people's body for all sorts of reasons, not least of which is if it's a woman and she's pregnant, she would have these same proteins there. So she would be classed as HIV positive, and all she's guilty of is being pregnant. And there's something like 60 different occasions where you would have these proteins in your body, which is nothing to do with HIV, but their test would say you're HIV positive. And that, of course, has ruined many people's lives. Now we've got the same thing again with the coronavirus. They've devised a test which is completely bogus and always has been, even by its inventor, said it's not for this reason, as I said earlier. And again, they're just looking for markers, as they call them, not the virus. And then if they find these markers, they say, oh, well, you've got the virus. It's just nonsense. So you're quite right with what you say, Bob, that the test is completely bogus and doesn't prove anything at all. And for that reason, I would recommend people do not subject themselves to it, because many people's lives were ruined by going for an HIV test and having a bogus result given to them, which they didn't know it was bogus. And then they get registered as HIV positive, and then they're forced into all sorts of restrictions and drug regimes, something that they haven't got. And we're going to go down the same route with this so-called coronavirus, where people are taking a test, which means nothing, but they get told that they've got it, and therefore they've got to be isolated, or they've got to go into hospital, or they've got to have this regime of medication. It's an awful thing based on complete nonsense.
Yeah.
And it's really time it gets put a stop to.
And when you consider a lot of these people are already sick to begin with, now they're filled with fear because they've been told that they have this deadly virus in them, and they're already on medications for other illnesses, most of them. And then they start getting more medications. They put them on antivirals, corticosteroids, they put them on ventilators. I mean, they just really hit the body with tons of other things with these people who are already not that healthy, because most people are not that healthy because of their diet and lifestyle. And then you add this to the mix and you push them over the edge, and then they blame it on the virus.
Exactly.
I mean, a lot of the people who have been claimed to be the sort of main victims of this so-called disease are, older people, over 80 with, like you say, certainly more than one underlying health problem. So, their bodies are already, toxic, and we can talk about what disease really means, I'm sure later on. So, they've got these conditions, their bodies are not healthy at all. And the fear factor, again, is really something that's quite important, because when, they do, the fear factor and your sort of, beliefs and ideas can actually have a, physical effect on the body. I mean, we know about the placebo and the nocebo effect. So the mind certainly has a big effect on the body. And this fear, this ramped up fear where everyone's got to be shut down, can't see people, no physical contact, and that can be extremely distressing for older people who are already unwell and maybe rely on other people to help them out. So suddenly they're isolated, they don't have the help they should have. Very distressing, and that can easily reduce their lifespan by by a year, by 6 months, bring it down to, and that's why, a lot of people have died. And so it's nothing, like you say, nothing to do with this so-called particle, but there are lots of other reasons. And of course, the toxic medications, there are so many parallels with this, with the whole HIV/AIDS scam that, in the 80s and 90s. And you can see that with, and I can't remember the name, I was trying to remember the name of some of the main antiviral drugs they're using, but they're pretty harsh. And so to a person's body who's already unhealthy, that's going to cause a lot more damage and create problems, and certainly shorten their lives.
I think it's interesting to note on that the late David Crowe, who unfortunately died a few weeks ago, did an examination of the Italian situation, which was supposed to have been one of the hotspots for this COVID thing, with lots of people dying. And when eventually the Italian authorities, who seemed to have been quite honest in the end and put out the sort of statistics of the people that had died, David Crowe examined those documents, and it was easy to see that the vast majority of the people that they were claiming as COVID deaths were literally old age people in their 80s, some in their 90s, and they'd all got 2 or more underlying serious health problems when they went into hospital. And then once they went into hospital, many of them were put on ventilators, which I think a lot of people don't realize just how severe that is. I mean, to put someone on a ventilator, they have to be under sedation, basically. So they're sort of almost comatose with this pipe stuffed down their throat, which is extremely invasive and dangerous to the body.
Distressing.
And most people die who are put on a ventilator, and particularly elderly people who are already have a compromised body because of the illnesses they get. And then, as you said, in addition to that, they put them on some extremely toxic antiviral drugs. I mean, it's a recipe that those people are going to die. And this is exactly what happened. But then the authorities were claiming them as COVID deaths. Really, they would have fallen under the category that we class and talk about in the book called iatrogenesis, which is death by modern medicine. And that's really what was killing these people. So, and this sort of thing has been going on all around the world. So not only have we got false tests, which they're using because it suits their purpose to try and make out that there's a lot more positive results. So let's close down this city. You know, it plays into their hands. But then they've got death rates. I mean, I will guarantee and put my reputation on the fact that no one anywhere in the world has died from COVID. No one.
I second that.
I would like to see someone prove it.
That's three of us. Yes.
Yeah, because no one can, because no one has. But it's the authorities running this, and they have another agenda, quite obviously. So it suits their purpose to, like those poor people who I just mentioned in Italy, they die, they're killed really by the medical establishment, and then just claim them as COVID. I mean, we've had similar things in the UK where people have died of a heart attack, quite obviously went into hospital with a heart attack, experiencing a heart attack, died of a heart attack, and they put died of COVID on their death certificate. So it's complete nonsense.
Another reason for that, I don't know about in England, but here the CDC issued a memorandum telling doctors basically they had the liberty to classify a death as COVID, not even with the test, just based on assumption. I mean, the test we know is bogus, but then they don't even need to test. They could just base it on assumption. And now they have or at least the hospitals had a monetary incentive, get up to $39,000 to put them, to classify them as COVID and put them on ventilators. So, again, it brings a lot into question in terms of how many people, as we said, we know no one actually died of COVID because they've never proven that this virus causes anything. So, but I'm saying a lot of people have gotten classified as that and based on no evidence at all, as you say.
Yeah.
But as you say, with the financial incentive, that's really worrying, but it shows, or rather it suggests strongly that it's not based on science, because if it was based on science, they wouldn't have to give that kind of financial incentive. It would be obvious. I mean, there's so much evidence that this isn't, and again, we can sort of move into the next point really, which is about the fact that it's supposed to be infectious or contagious. That's why they're obviously isolating everybody so that it's not passed on. But again, that's something else for which there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that any of these so-called infectious or contagious diseases actually are spread between people. And that's really why the subtitle of our book is Why Everything You Think You Know About Disease Is Wrong, because disease is not an entity that people spread between each other. They're not passed between each other. And that's another big area that people have quite a problem actually comprehending, because everyone's grown up, it's been in place for over 150 years that these diseases are infectious, they spread, you can pass it along, if you cough, sneeze. But we were saying before that there have been experiments where they've tried to do that, to actually pass diseases on the so-called normal route, which is sneezing, coughing into somebody else's face, because that's how these so-called particles are supposed to be transmitted. But they haven't been able to do it that way. So they create all kinds of ghastly concoctions to try and prove something is contagious or infectious, or so that they can do that. And some of the experiments were the ones they used with polio, where because they couldn't get some kind of transmission in any other way, they ended up grinding spinal tissue from somebody who died from polio, or who'd been paralyzed, and the only way to actually get that kind of reaction in the laboratory animals, which were monkeys at the time, was that they put this ground up spinal gunk in, and they injected into monkey brains. Now, that is not the normal way of any disease transmission, but because these monkeys then became paralyzed, they said, "Oh, see, we've proved it's it's been transmitted. It's an infectious or it's a contagious disease."
Which has nothing to do probably with what they put in, but just the mechanical, damage to the brain. I mean, that's putting a needle in the brain could cause damage. I mean.
Yes, I mean, traumatic to the animal. I mean, they're regarded as sort of, lower creatures, but that would still be traumatic to an animal to have something injected. But that's, like you say, besides what they were putting in, which was just horrible, it's just this noxious matter. So that's enough to have caused all kinds of problems. And quite often in vaccines and these different preparations, there'll be all kinds of toxic materials, including potentially neurotoxic materials. So that wouldn't be too surprising that these animals would become paralyzed. And it's got nothing to do with the transmission of a so-called polio virus, because again, not been isolated, never been proven to exist to cause paralysis. So, again, that's just an example, but, it's just the starting point of trying to say, these diseases are called infectious and contagious, but again, not much proof or no proof whatsoever.
Not at all. I mean, we always tell people to go back to basics, First of all, you've got to prove, in the virus case, that the virus exists and does something before, because if you can't do that, then everything else is fiction. So trying to conduct experiments to try and then prove, you can get it by sneezing on someone or touching them. It's all pointless if you can't prove that there's an infectious agent in the first place. But even when, as Dawn said, even when they've done those experiments, and there's quite a lot done during the 1918 so-called flu epidemic, and I'm sure people have probably heard the story, but it's always worth repeating, where they sort of got groups of unhealthy people who supposedly got the flu, and they wanted to try and see if they could pass it to healthy people. I think they were using prisoners, so so they were sort of a captive audience, really.
There were a few sets. That was one of them. Yeah, there were a few sets.
But I mean, they did everything they could they had them sit directly in front of the healthy person and cough and sneeze directly in their face. They took mucus swabs from the unhealthy people and sort of inserted into the nasal passages. And on not one occasion were they able to transmit the flu, as they thought it was, to the healthy person. On not one occasion. And there's been lots of experiments done like that. So, I mean, it just shows that there's nothing infectious or contagious from a germ.
And I'll add something to that, because I've been I'm an acupuncturist, as you know, and I work very closely with people. I've been doing this for over 30 years, and I'm in very close contact with people. And a lot of people come in when they have a flu or a cold because they want to help speed themselves through it. And acupuncture can help do that by fortifying the body, getting the energy moving. And so over the 30 years I've been doing this, I've had, thousands of encounters with sick people who have colds and flus. I've never gotten anything. And they're breathing in my face, many times coughing in my face, sneezing in my face while I'm working on them. And why is it I don't get anything? Well, maybe it's because I'm an asymptomatic carrier. In that case, I should have spread it to all my other clients who didn't get sick after. So, I mean, that's another theory that's totally, you can shoot full of holes. But I've never gotten sick from any encounters with these people who, like I say, have been sneezing, coughing, breathing in my face. And so they're...
Yes, and that is evidence. I mean, it's often said, kind of all scientific evidence, get that from the laboratory. But no, I mean, real experiences of real people in the real world. And like you say, that's absolutely, that's strong evidence that they cannot be contagious. But as you say, they'll find all kinds of excuses or labels. I like David Crow's description or definition of an asymptomatic carrier. He calls them a healthy person.
Yes, exactly.
I like to tell a little story about that sort of thing, because it just shows what a nonsense it is. And So if we look back to the story of Typhoid Mary, which some people may have heard of, and so we're going back to sort of 1907, when within New York in America there was typhoid outbreaks. Okay, and this lady, or I only know her as Mary, was sort of worked in service, in the big houses, doing sort of fairly menial work. But some of her contacts, she was coming into contact with people with typhoid, but she never caught it. And the authorities, long story short, the authorities thought that she must therefore be a carrier. But as we've said, the modern term is asymptomatic, i.e. you can have the disease, but it doesn't make you ill. So they decided that because she was never getting ill, that therefore she was obviously a public menace. And so they incarcerated her into an institution and put her in solitary confinement. And to make matters worse, they kept her there for the rest of her life, which was another 30 years. And she died in the institution. So we're going back to now sort of around 1940 when she died. So this within living memory, and the medical establishment has still thought that that was a good idea to put a healthy person into isolation. Now, doesn't that ring a few bells of what we've got going off today? Yes. We're putting healthy people into isolation, yes. Not into a prison or an institution, but they're imprisoning you in your own house. Absolutely. When you're healthy. So in the last 100 years or so, the medical establishment hasn't learned anything, and it brings me back to my quote, which is on the back of our book from Voltaire, which says, "Doctors are men who prescribe medicines of which they know little, to cure diseases of which they know less, in human beings of whom they know nothing." And I think that's very apt. And I think the Typhoid Mary story just shows exactly that. 1907 to present day, and they're doing exactly the same thing for no scientific reasons whatsoever.
The thing with that is that the idea of an asymptomatic carrier it's more than an anomaly, but it is an anomaly. Sorry, get my tongue around that. But because diseases, by definition, are diagnosed according to their signs and symptoms. So in other words, you have signs and symptoms in order to have a disease. So if there are no signs or symptoms, you cannot have a disease. Now, because these so-called particles, germs, bacteria, whatever, are supposed to be the causes of the symptoms, that if there aren't symptoms, then the presence of these so-called microbes or the microbes or these particles means that they cannot possibly cause the symptoms, which means they cannot possibly cause disease. I mean, there's a complete lack of logic. If the presence of these microbes are the cause of disease, then there should be symptoms and disease. And if there are no symptoms, there's no disease. And if there are microbes present, then they're nothing to do with whatever is called disease, which again takes us back to why the medical establishment doesn't seem to understand what disease is,
because they violate their own rules. They violate Koch's postulates.
I was just going to get to that. Yep, go ahead. Take it
they
away.
Violate it. So you think, well, why do you have these rules if when it doesn't suit you, you just totally ignore them? But then, as we've learned, and through the process of 10 years of researching, that they ignore true science all the time. And I mean, I'd like to give another example for those that have not heard it. I mean, it's only about 3 years ago in Germany, people may have started to hear of Dr. Stefan Lanker, and he was a virologist, trained as a virologist, but he doesn't like to be called that anymore. He's still a doctor, but he doesn't like to be called a virologist because he realizes it's a corrupt carry-on. He doesn't prove anything. It's complete nonsense. And anyway, cut a long story short, he challenged the medical establishment in Germany to prove that a virus caused measles. And he offered 100,000 euros if they could do it. So, a considerable sum of money. And of course, obviously, the big guns from the medical establishment sort of went to court to prove this. And he went through 2 court cases and eventually ended up in the Supreme Court in Germany. And they lost their case. They put forward 6 scientific papers which they believed would prove that a virus caused measles. And within the court examination with expert witnesses, it was shown that they didn't prove anything of the sort. Mm-hmm. And the medical establishment lost their case. They could not prove that a virus caused measles. Mm-hmm. So, but does the world know about that? No. You know, you really have to dig to find that. But to make matters worse, in, I think it was March of this year, in Germany, mm-hmm. the German authorities mandated that all school children must be vaccinated against measles. And you think, well, it was in your own court just a few years ago. So it's another example of how the authorities are not basing any of their actions on science. You know, they're completely devoid of any science. And I think that's a really important point for people to realize, you know, with the things about not being able to isolate and prove the viruses or bacteria cause disease, to the cases of typhoid Mary, to the cases of Stefan Lanke just a few years ago. All of these are very strong indications that the authorities are not basing any of their work and decisions on science. And that should be very, very worrying to the general public, and would be a good reason, I would think, to have nothing to do with the sort of proclamations that the governments are putting out.
Yeah, and
so
getting back to the Cox postulates, they say, oh, well, they're outdated. Cox postulates are just pure logic and common sense. How can they be outdated? You're just saying we want to find this virus or this particle, whatever, that's supposedly causing this disease. So we're going to get it from this person, isolate it, characterize it, and then take that isolated particle, put it in a healthy person and see if it causes the disease. They haven't done that. But what's so outdated about that? It's just common sense and logic. You know, they're using every excuse in the book because they can't fulfill those postulates, and they never have and they never will.
Absolutely. I mean, as you say, sort of logic and common sense, because you know, it's stated that everyone who has the particular disease is supposed to have the actual causal agent in their body. It should always be found in there, and people without the disease should not have, or that particle shouldn't be present, or the bacterium shouldn't be present with people. Sorry, no, which way around have I said it? The wrong way around. Yes, okay. It should always be found where there is disease, and it should never be found
when there's not
disease. There's no, yes, when there's no disease. That's right. But it goes back to sorry, I was just going to sort of develop the point for discussing bacteria, because they are living microbes. They're not the same as these particles that are called viruses, these other particles. They are rather different. Unfortunately, it was Robert Koch, whose name's been given to the postulates, who is believed to have, well, he's called the father of bacteriology. He's believed to have proven that I think the first disease, or one of the first ones, was tuberculosis, was caused by a particular bacterium. But even that failed to be proven in every single case, that when that the bacterium was always there in people with the disease and never there in people without the disease. And there are certainly plenty of people who have, and various papers, and I can't think back, early part of the 20th century, who people in that field, in microbiology, were saying that the actual bacterium was never found in the early stages of tuberculosis. It was only ever found in later stages. Now, if it's the causal agent, it should always be found in the early stages, because it is the cause, so it would have to be there. And the fact that it's never there, and again, this is a quote, and I can't remember exactly which doctor, but a medical doctor, qualified, highly qualified, highly respected, saying it was never there in the early stages. And that should ring alarm bells, that it cannot possibly be the causal agent. And so whenever we looked in all the disease, all these so-called infectious diseases, whether claimed to be caused by bacterium or a particle called a virus, the evidence fell apart. It was never solid in every single case, in whatever disease or whatever condition we were looking at. And so the evidence really isn't there. It may be there in, apparently the bacterium found in some cases, but it would have to be found in all cases. And exceptions do not prove the rule. Exceptions means that the rule needs to be relooked at,
right,
and reevaluated, and the hypothesis needs to be re-examined. And again, it's called the germ theory because it's never been proven. It's still a theory. And 150 years later, it's time for it to be put to one side, and people start realizing that it's a defunct theory, and we need to look at actually what really causes people to be ill.
right.
Which of course is what our book is all about, as to what really makes you ill. But of
And
course
go ahead.
I was just going to say, but the big rub there, of course, is that as the germ theory became popular with the burgeoning pharmaceutical industry, of course, it's great for them because they make billions out of it. So if you took away the germ theory, I mean, they have no industry, because all as they're doing is producing lotions and potions and vaccinations to kill either bacteria or viruses. That's all they do. So if you take that away and say, well, there's no evidence to prove that these things cause any disease, so we don't need any of your lotions and potions. We'll look for what the real causes of disease are, which again is what we look at in our book, and what to do about that. So sorry, Bob, I interrupted you.
No, anyway, but yeah, getting back to Stefan Lanka, we're talking about, like, in the practical world, doing those experiments that they did in 1918 with trying to get this past the infection from person to person. Well, they say, well, at least we proved that in the laboratory. And as Stefan Lanka says, they don't even prove it in the laboratory, because in the laboratory, they take these cells that, from cancer tumors or wherever they get them, and they put them in a petri dish. They pretty much starve them. They badger them with all kinds of chemicals, antibiotics and other things. And then they put the supposed virus in there it's not just the isolated virus, it's a concoction of many different things. And the cell starts to die, disintegrate, and they say that's proof. Well, that's not proof of anything. That's proof that you've killed a cell and it's dying, it's disintegrating, and resulting into, it's disintegrating to many different pieces, which is what they're seeing and saying that they're viruses, or some people are calling them exosomes. But again, even in the laboratory, they haven't really proved anything. It's all just indirect assumptions.
Correct. Yeah,
Yes,
that's absolutely correct.
But following these laboratory procedures has now been classified as being isolation of a virus. And so if they follow those particular procedures and they get a particular cytotoxic effect, I mean, if they're looking for specific cytotoxic effects, I believe is, part of it. So certain effects means, oh, that's it, that's the virus. It's and they forget about all the other procedures that that would have had an adverse effect on the cell.
Right.
I mean, that's something that was brought out quite amazingly by Dr. Harold Hillman, a PhD. Right. He spent decades looking at the actual laboratory procedures, and he wrote quite extensively on the fact that the procedures would have a particular effect on the cell. And in fact, some of the effects were what he called artifacts of the procedures. They're nothing to do with anything that's ever found in the living human body. And that again goes back to the Voltaire quote that researchers studying these bits and pieces in the laboratory aren't studying a living, intact human body. Right. And so just because something happens in a petri dish, they're making the assumption that that is what's happening in the body. And a lot of what they're using in their petri dishes, like you say, is bovine serum and antibiotics and all sorts of other, cancer cells and whatever. They're not natural to the body. And so they're creating a completely artificial environment and saying that's what happens in the body, but it's not the body's environment. It's amazing.
Well, I call it a magic show, because in the laboratory, you can create anything. You can set the criteria, set the conditions, and you can create anything. It's a magic show. But even Stefan Lanka takes this one step further, and he talks about these videos they show of viruses attacking or hijacking a cell and then injecting themselves into the cell and multiplying. And all these videos they show, they're all computer generated. These are all just, they're not real life things, because you can't see living action in an electron microscope. In order to see something as small as a virus in an electron microscope, it has to be totally treated dead, and all they're seeing is a still shot. So all these things are assumptions. They're all just assumptions, and they're all computer generated graphics. Even the common picture they show of the coronavirus, that's not an electron microscope image. It's this computer generated image that's been colored, and again, it's totally based on assumption. And he covers that really well. Of course, also Dr. Kaufman, Dr. Cohen, they talk about this as well in a video I had just posted a few days ago. But yeah, it's all just, it's Hollywood. It's totally, made up.
Yeah, absolutely right. And of course, it deceives the public, and it's meant to. It's meant to deceive the public, because at no stage, because we had the same thing in the UK with all these coloured, look like limpets and mines floating about in wonderful 3D and all sorts of colours, little tentacles sticking out the sides. Nothing, but at no time does the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, or any of the mainstream media, at no time do they just say, well, this is just a representation. It's a computer graphic. It's not actually, no, they never say that at all. They want you to believe, oh, you're seeing the real thing, so it does exist. And of course, many people are gullible enough to take that in and think that's what they're looking at. So it must exist because I've seen it on the television. The whole thing is a big con. And I'm just surprised. I'm really surprised that so many people have fallen for it, even to this day. And particularly with all the nonsense that's been going around with, oh, if you stand 2 meters apart, the virus can't get you, or if you wear one of these masks, it can't get you, which, I mean, the science of the masks and all the rest of it, well, there isn't any science. That's the whole thing.
Well, and I want to add to that. You were saying, why are people falling for it? Well, the layman obviously will fall for a lot of things because they don't have the knowledge. But even the doctors, as Dr. Kaufman and Cohen said, they're not really taught in depth a lot of this about virology in medical school. And then once they get through medical school, they have bills to pay. They've invested all those years, all that time and energy. They've got an allegiance to it, so to speak. And they're not just going to give it all up or challenge it. I mean, that's a big step. And very few doctors want to take that step. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think they call it cognitive dissonance, where they can't hold that sort of perception when the training has just been so constant after so many years. And it's and I think even Thomas Cowell was talking about something he was explaining, but he was explaining it in the kind of establishment way, because that's how he was trained, even though there was something that he felt, no, this isn't quite right, but that's what I've been taught. So he kept going down that route, but he got he had the distinct impression that there was something wrong with it. There was something wrong with it, but it's getting out of that training, kind of pulling themselves away from it. It does take quite an effort, and I mean, it's good that some are doing it. It's just a shame that there aren't enough that are seeing just how ridiculous everything is at the moment, that they aren't saying, hang on a minute, there's something wrong here. I mean, some are, but they aren't quite going as far as to say that, like all so-called these particles are, none of them are contagious or infectious or cause disease, but many of them are starting to really question this one, because they see that it's not actually doing what it's reported to do. So, there are some problems, but at the same time, the ridiculous nature of what's going on it is helping to get people to sort of think about it. But then, as we were saying before, that it ends up spreading a lot of confusing information, because some are saying, well, it's not as bad as that, but it still exists. And others are saying, well, no, this particular virus doesn't exist, but others do. Right. And so no wonder the public gets confused, because there's just a lot of misleading information. I'm not saying it's done deliberately, I've no idea, but I suspect maybe somewhere along the line there are people kind of confusing the issue, right. Which is why it's so important to say, right, to get to the actual heart of it and say there is no evidence, never has been, that any of these so-called particles called viruses cause disease.
Right.
And similarly, there is no evidence that any bacterium causes disease.
Right.
And, you know, to keep it as clear as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
And I was just going to add, and the other part is now they're touting all these different cures for the COVID, you know, symptoms. And again, that's another misleading thing, because the flu, which is what it is, it's just another form of the flu, which is a detox, is something your body needs to do. It's a good thing. It's because you've been living wrong and your body's full of toxins and debris that it needs to do this. And they're saying it's a deadly disease that needs to be stopped. Don't use this drug, use this cure, this natural cure. And it's like they still don't get the concept that the flu is not bad, it's not deadly. It can be deadly if it's mistreated, mismanaged, which is what a lot of the doctors do, because they stifle the body, they suppress the body's efforts, and then they add more toxins, and then they push people over the edge. But the flu itself is a good thing. If I get the flu, and I haven't got one in many, many, many years, I welcome it and say, wow, I must have been living wrong. I've been under a lot of stress, poisoning my body, doing things I shouldn't do, eating things I shouldn't eat. And now it's my body saying, okay, it's time for a cleansing. And when it happens, the best thing to do is go to bed, stop eating, just drink fluids, rest. And within a few days, all of it's out of you and you feel like brand new again. But no, these people are looking at it as, oh, this is a bad thing. We need to stop it. But don't use the medical drugs. We'll use the herbs, or we'll use this or that. But again, they're missing the whole point of what it is and what the purpose of it is.
Yes. Going back to the 1918 flu, one of the papers that we discovered was that aspirin was being prescribed, but at particularly high doses, and that was certainly causing a lot of people who were ill. So again, aspirin was taken to suppress symptoms, which of course is the wrong thing, as you say. But that was one of the reasons, or one of the causes of some of the deaths. I mean, there were plenty of other causes, but certainly the overuse of a high dose. Well, it was the high dose because it was particularly toxic. I mean, aspirin is toxic, but it was particularly toxic. So yeah, there's some evidence for that as well. There is a paper on that.
I think it's a very important point that you made there, Bob, about cold and flu, which are just different severities of getting rid of toxins in the body. And of course, the reported symptoms of COVID are the same, you know, because, you know, the coughing, the mucous membranes coming into action, the fevers, all of these are very common symptoms for the body being poisoned in some way. And as you say, not things to be suppressed, but that's what the medical establishment does. And it's very common at the moment with this COVID thing that people who ought to know better are touting the idea that this drug called hydroxychloroquine, have I got it right?
Yes.
I still remember the title. That, you know, this is the answer. And, you know, some doctors are saying this. You know, that they've used this on COVID patients, and you know, it's a really good thing, and they get better. You know, so therefore they're demanding from their governments that it should be readily available so that we can save people's lives. Again, you know, I mean, it's a very similar thing to what was happening in the 80s with HIV, and they came up with AZT or AZT as it would be known in America. And the homosexual community was demanding this drug. You know, it's going to help us all and keep us fit and well and stop us dying. And they were playing straight into the trap. I mean, the doses of AZT that was given in the early 80s killed everybody. You know, everyone died that took that high level of dosage. You know, and I'm thinking of people like the leader of Queen, Freddie Mercury,
Arthur Ashe,
Arthur Ashe, and Rudolf Nureyev. You know, some very high-level people, because they thought that was the thing that was going to help them, and it killed them all. So the medical establishment sort of started to realise their mistake and thought, well, you know, but they kept quiet about it, and they started reducing the strength of the dose. Well, they still use AZT. I think they even still use it now, but it's highly toxic. I think it started out as a cancer treatment. It was nothing to do with AIDS or anything like it, but they'd got this thing. They didn't understand what was happening with AIDS. So we thought, well, let's try this, and that's what they were giving people. But when it started killing them all, they just sort of, rather than say, let's stop using this, they thought, well, we'll just give people less dose, a smaller dose of it, which just meant that it just took longer for people to die, basically. So the medical establishment are really dangerous in their ignorance. And it is ignorance, we're not trying to make out that doctors are evil people, right, and are deliberately injuring people. They're just ignorant, and that's in the proper sense of the word. Their training has not given them the correct information. Right. And it's as simple as that.
And I might add to that iatrogenic disease, or what they call doctor-caused disease, the medical profession themselves is saying it's as high as 440,000 people alone die in the U.S. alone each year for medical mistakes or iatrogenic, illnesses. But that's not even taking into account all the other people who are dying that they don't take into account, because they think, well, it's normal, it's not a mistake. But yet the procedures, the drugs that they're using are killing people, but they just haven't attributed it to that. So it's way higher than the 440,000 that they're saying.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems with in America, unfortunately, is that most people in America are on at least one, if not two, three more, or four or five, drugs. And this is not just adults, this includes children as well. Unfortunately, every sort of, younger ages, and certainly putting them on the kind of ADHD drugs and those sorts of horrible things. So yes, I mean, I don't know if it's particularly different from other countries, but I know it really is a big problem in America that many people are on multiple drugs. The polypharmacy, as they call it, and I mean it's big business for the pharmaceutical industry. But again, going back to the idea of the having to kill these germs, it's not just the pharmaceutical industry. Of course, there are other parts of the chemical industry that have all their antibiotic type chemicals that are put into various products. I mean, even to the point of, socks having antibacterial, and again, soaps and washes and all kinds of cleaning agents. So they're all antibacterial, because the only way to keep things clean is to kill the germs. And I mean, it is so pervasive that people think that the only problem by sort of, shall we say, being unclean is because of the germs. That's the only reason you clean anything, is to get rid of germs.
Right. And I want to add to that you talk about killing germs, and you can kill a germ because it's a living organism. But a viral particle, which is just a debris from the cell, they even say it's dead. It doesn't have any qualities of a living organism. It's a dead thing, and yet they say we need to kill it. Well, you can't kill something that's already dead.
Exactly.
So hence antivirals are dreadful, but I mean, they are toxic because they're intended to kill. Antibiotics intended to kill. Right. So they cannot be good for a living body.
Well, what the antivirals do is they affect the body in general. It's a toxin. It's a neurotoxin. It affects the nervous system. But it's not killing any virus because the virus is already dead,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Again, more indication of just what a nonsense and unscientific procedures that the medical establishment use. Okay, I think there was just another point I think might be just worth mentioning, because talking about the flu and colds, because that comes up a lot, is that because they quite often, the authorities like to talk about the flu season, and I think it might just be worth mentioning the flu season. Normally, one of the flu seasons, as they call it, is probably in January, February time, so not long after Christmas, when, as we understand it, of course, people have been going through the festivities of excessive alcohol and excessive food of all types of richnesses, and so what does the body do? Sort of come January, it starts to detox from all the rubbish people have put into their bodies, and of course, detox symptoms are what they then call flu. But that's the body detoxing all the rubbish that they've had over the Christmas period. Absolutely. So but they've then said, oh, it's the flu season. No, it's the detox season. That's what it
Yes.
actually is. And
Exactly.
one of the other flu seasons, normally when you look at what happens, is always succeeds one of their promotional campaigns for the flu jab. So
Yeah.
they want to, as many people as they can, all the doctors' surgeries, come in, get your free flu jab, every hospital. And then lo and behold, a few months down the line, everyone's got the flu, so, oh, this is the second flu season. Well, yes, but it was brought on by the flu jab that everyone's having, because now you've just loaded these people up with another load of toxins, which the body is getting rid of. And you get what they call flu or heavy colds.
We
So
call it the flu vaccine
think,
here, not the jab, just so Americans watching this, they might know
all
what
right.
we mean by the jab.
Okay.
Go ahead,
Okay.
sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, you call them flu shot, don't you?
Our flu shot, flu vaccine.
Oh, okay, yeah. Terminology.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah.
But the other
Yes.
fact too is after the holidays, when people have just been gorging themselves on all this food, overeating, alcohol and sugar and this and that. But then it's usually a seasonal change too, where you have temperature drops, and so the body's subjected to different temperatures all of a sudden. And so there's a lot of different factors that come into play. But I'd say it's probably mostly diet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that major factor. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's sort of important for people to realise the similarities that we've been talking about of things past and present, and the misrepresentation that the authorities, and I'm talking about the media, the medical establishment and governments, they're working in conjunction, if you like. Most of the people are ignorant of what they're saying. The talking heads on the television, they're just working from a script. They're just telling what they're told to tell, which is perpetrated by this hidden agenda, which is not based on science, and which is based on sort of social engineering, really, with the agenda of, well, I think it's quite appropriate to say, because it's quite obvious, I think, to many people now, there is an agenda which has been going on for many decades, where people often refer to as globalists, who have an agenda to basically have a one world government, which will be them, of course, and unelected. They would like to do away with individual governments in countries, so there's just this one world government that controls everything, and obviously controls the people as well. And the people is, of course, their biggest headache, because people are not that easy to control for the most part. Well, not the thinking ones anyway, but if they can brainwash enough people, as they appear to be doing quite a good job of, to be compliant just long enough for them to gain more and more control. And of course, if they can, as they're doing at the moment, they're disrupting every country. Businesses are going out of business, people are losing their jobs, people are losing their houses, they're becoming destitute, they're becoming depressed, there's people committing suicide rates have gone up. So they're becoming more and more ill, then they're turning to the doctors and taking more medications, which then makes them more ill and causing a lot more deaths. So once you've got a population that is in fear all the time, is sick and destitute for the most part, they're much more easy to control. And so they're more compliant with the, as they start to look to government, well, sort of save us from this. It's the Hegelian dialectic, isn't it? And they get away with it every time. And this is what we're seeing now. And of course, I believe, a slight bit of speculation on my part, which I don't normally do, but I believe the mask wearing thing is designed to be an outward sign to these globalist type people of just how much they've got people under their control, how compliant people are. It's almost like wearing a badge, that said, I believe, wear the mask. I believe what you're telling me. I'm compliant. I'm doing what you tell me. So I'm a good boy or good girl.
Yeah, good little citizen.
Whereas the ones like us who absolutely refuse to wear them because we know the truth, well, we're marked out as well. They go, oh, well, we'll keep our eye on those, So I think there's a lot of that. I think it's about social engineering and getting people to obey, no matter how ridiculous the rules are. And even many people who see that the rules are ridiculous, of the social distancing and wearing masks, They see that they're ridiculous, but they still comply,
Mm-hmm.
rather than saying, I'm having nothing to do with this. This is a nonsense. It's not based on science. I'm not risking anyone's life, so I'm not going to do it. And more people need to do that.
Right.
I think one of the reasons that they don't is some of them still have this underlying fear, uncertainty about, you know, these particles called viruses, that they may be infectious, that, you know, because they've got this experience or this background knowledge of, you know, when people get together and, you know, they pass diseases amongst themselves, you know, so if somebody sneezes and coughs and has these symptoms that they call either cold or flu or something like that, and somebody nearby seems to have the same kind of symptoms, they say, oh, I've passed my cold on to you. It is so much part of common language, common understanding, and that seems to be quite difficult to kind of break through, because even though, you know, and we get people writing to us who say, well, I kind of understand that, you know, the germ theory is unproven, but what about you know, colds and flu? What about chickenpox? What about these measles? What about the chickenpox parties? You know, children have these parties and they get together and they all have chickenpox, and so, you know, and it makes them immune for the rest of their lives. They never get it, so that's why they need to get it. There's something to get, and again, it's all this terminology that is so ingrained in people that they are finding it difficult to release, to sort of see it more clearly. And so, you know, we do understand, but unfortunately people have got to get through that barrier as quickly as possible, because they've got to realize that they are being made to live in fear on the basis of something that is completely, well, not just unproven, but just untrue. But we understand that it is a process, because they just see people experiencing these symptoms at the same kind of time.
And we do explain in the book as to why that is.
Yeah, go ahead, explain on that.
First of all, we always ask people to go back to square one and say, well, is there any proof that the virus stroke bacteria causes the disease? No, there isn't. And that's why it's a 800-page book. You know, we take people through that journey to show there's not, and there's much more plausible reasons as to why people become ill and what to do about it. So we say, bear that in mind, first of all. And they say, yes, but what about the symptoms? Okay, well, all of these symptoms, and chickenpox and measles are no different. It's when the body is trying to expel something from the body, and it comes out in different ways. If it can't get it out through the normal sort of body methods of excretion, it will come out through the largest organ of the body, which is the skin. And so all of these skin eruptions are, again, the body attempting to get some probably quite serious toxins out of the body as quickly as it can. And all of these blisters and rashes that come up on the skin are exact examples of that. And they may say then, well, what about a group of children who get together and they all seem to get chickenpox at the same time? Well, one is they don't all get it at the same time, so it's a bit of a myth that they do. But secondly, we say to them, well, we've already shown you that it's nothing to do with a virus or a bacteria, so we're not saying that your children don't get the blisters or whatever. It's nothing to do with the germ, so it's going to be something else. And then you've got to say, well, you've got to look at what the environment is that the children are in, both in the home environment, the school environment, the toxins they come into contact with, what are their eating habits, what are their medication habits, what is their vaccination regime? You know, because children of a certain age tend to get their load of vaccinations at a certain age, and therefore the body is going to start detoxifying those substances all around the same time. And so you get what could be called childhood illnesses. You know, groups of children of a similar age have undergone similar experiences of poisoning, basically, and the bodies are trying to get rid of it, and that's really what a lot of these childhood illnesses are all about.
There's also the suggestion factor, the nocebo effect, because children are very suggestible.
Yes,
I mean, there's all these factors that come into play.
Yes, well, I mean, if they're going to go to a party because they're parents or the mother, whatever, has said, oh, you know, you need to go to this party so that you can get chicken pox while you're still young, because you know, it's not so bad then, it'll be worse as you get older. So that's already been planted into their heads. The other thing is that children's parties are not always, but notorious for lots of, shall we say, let's put it.
Toxic waste.
Well, I was going to say junk food. I was going to say junk food. So lots of sweets and sugary drinks and all kinds of treats. But obviously, so it's really not very good food. And so I suppose it's not too surprising that a number of them, not necessarily all of them, but a number of them will then have these toxic eruptions from their skin, because the body's saying, well, because refined sugar is really, you know, one of the toxins. I mean, people know that sort of sugar's not bad, but it's they say, oh, cut down, but no, cut out refined sugar. But going back to experiences, one particular thing is that I know from actual experience that not every child who goes to one of these parties gets it, you know, has these symptoms. So, you know, that's not true. I know it's not always the case.
It's a minority, actually. So.
Yeah.
Well, yes, but just because a few, and they say, oh, well, you know, everyone's got it. It's the exaggeration. Oh, well, everyone's got it. No, did everyone get it? Actually, no, not everyone. Yes. Oh, in fact, actually, oh no, there were quite a few that didn't. But it's always.
Even in the greatest pandemics or epidemics, it's still a very small percentage of the overall population that gets it. So, I mean, it's,
Yeah. So it's all blown out of proportion and exaggerated, and even made, a lot of it is just pure fiction.
Right.
But of course, people are very, and we get quite a bit of it sometimes when people write to us, they're sort of, they latch onto things that they've not actually bottomed out, they've not actually proved to be true, and they're just myths, really.
Right.
They perpetuate these myths, and you have to try and dispel them. And so that's why we take people back to the basics and say, let's look if the evidence is there that this germ that you're accusing of making your daughter or son ill, does it exist? Has it ever been proved to exist? Has it been proved to be infectious? Because if it hasn't, whatever's making your child ill is not a germ, it's something else, and we'd need to look at that in greater detail.
So is that a good time to kind of discuss what really makes you ill, then kind of go into more?
Let's do it.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, we in our book, over the 10 years it took us to write it, we're obviously asking that question too. Well, if it's not germs that make people ill, what does make people ill? And cutting a very long story short, sort of a 10-year story short, really, we sort of boiled it down to 4 factors that all illness stems from, and not least of which is lack of proper nutrition. And that was really one of the most important things, because without the proper nutrition, the body can't look after itself. It can't expel these toxins properly. And so they accumulate in the body, and then the body deteriorates even more. And getting the correct nutrition, we found that the plant-based diet was the best diet. Dawn and I are both vegans, and I believe you are too, Bob. And we found that was not only the healthiest diet, but also ethically the best way to live, for all sorts of reasons that we won't go into now, but certainly the most ethical. But importantly, it's the most healthy way. But very important, though, where you get that plant-based diet from. I know it's very easy to go down to the supermarket and just buy the fruit and vegetables from there, but they're not necessarily the best sources of vitamins and minerals because of the sort of farming methods where a lot of crops are grown and they're sprayed with various pesticides and fertilizers, chemical fertilizers, which kill the soil. And so the plants don't necessarily get to uptake the vitamins and minerals from the soil, because the human body can only deal with organic minerals. It can't deal with them in their inorganic form, which of course many supplements that you could go and buy from your health shop are in an inorganic form. So the body really can't assimilate them, so they don't really do much good. They just get excreted. So you need the plants to do that because they can transform it from inorganic to organic, which is easily assimilated by the body. But again, you've got to look at, well, where are those plants grown? What's the health of the soils that they're grown in? So again, cut a long story short, obviously organically grown fruit and vegetables, nuts and seeds are going to be your best source, because at least you know there's been better control over how they're grown, and that they're not sprayed with horrible chemicals, and that they're grown in healthy soils. So you've much better chance of having plants that have got the right levels of nutrients in them which your body can use. So diet is extremely important, and the source of food. Now that sort of, because I mentioned veganism, because I want to sound a note of warning to people, because there's certain manufacturers that have jumped on this vegan bandwagon, and there's all sorts of so-called vegan foods that are available in the shops, the supermarkets, but they're processed foods, you know. This is not the same as fresh fruits and vegetables. Yes, it's very easy to make something that's vegan under their terms, which has got no animal products in it. That doesn't mean it's healthy and nutritious. And so a lot of people can eat these convenience foods saying, well, I'm vegan, I'm just eating vegan food, and then wonder why they get ill. Well, it's because you're not eating nutritious food. And it's a very important thing for people to bear in mind. You know, the same as people could be vegetarian, but not have a healthy diet. You know, you need the range of vitamins and minerals.
But it's not just a question of, I mean, yes, that's the healthiest diet, but that actually is the natural diet for humans. And I know that's not going to be terribly palatable to a number of people, because they think that humans should have some kind of animal products for their diet, or it's natural. But we say that, you know, long habits of doing something doesn't actually necessarily mean that it's correct. Right. You know, like mercury was used as a medicine for hundreds of years. That doesn't mean it was right. It was toxic. It is always was toxic. But and this is something that you know more about, the natural hygiene method of you know, well, program. I don't know quite what you call it, natural hygiene. I believe that began best part of 200 years ago. That was started by medically qualified medically qualified doctors, physicians. They were looking into how the body really works, and this, well, you know more about the history of this, but they realized that the natural diet of the human body, you know, for the human body is plant-based, you know, and they were quite strict on that. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. They've done comparative anatomy studies, and our digestive system is most in line with frugivores, which are apes, monkeys. So just by design of our system, you know, they know what our ideal food is. Now, I'd say this, that people say, well, I know someone, he lived to 100 years old and he ate meat and did this. And I say, well, you can survive on an animal-based diet, but you can't thrive on it. That's what Shelton used to say. You can survive on it, but you can't thrive on it. And so when you eat more according to our biological design, your body's going to function better, and overall, mentally, physically, emotionally. So yeah, I mean, the body does adapt to a degree, you know, under circumstances where, you know, certain foods aren't available, your body tries to do the best that it can to survive, but it's not going to thrive.
And I think it's quite good that, because a lot of people have access to Netflix, and there's a video on Netflix called The Game Changers, which I would recommend people watch, because these are all top line athletes who show that they're on vegan diets, and these are top of the game athletes, whether they're the strongest man in the world or the fastest or the or even racing car drivers, and they've said that since they went vegan, their health improved, their performance improved, and they're purely vegan, on a proper vegan diet, not this factory generated stuff from the real food. Proper real food.
And there's other movies on Netflix showing how people cured themselves of various chronic illnesses that they said were incurable by going on a plant-based, mostly raw, whole food diet.
Yeah. So, you know, if anyone who's got access to Netflix, they can watch that for free, and I would recommend it. It's very convincing for anyone who has any doubt just how powerful and healthy a vegan diet is. So that's one thing. So yes, diet is very important. The right kind of diet, plant-based diet, very important. That's one of our main 4 factors. Second is, of course, minimizing, ideally eliminating toxic intake. So it's very important to be very much aware of what you put in and on your body. So it's whatever you eat, drink, and also cosmetics, washing things, any cleaning products, is to be aware of the toxicity of those things. And so you've got to minimize it, absolutely. So basically stop poisoning your body from what you put in or on it. So that's the second.
So you need to read labels, really be aware of the ingredients of the products that you're buying. And it might sound tedious, but it can make a huge difference with your health, because certainly either cleaning products, personal care products, laundry products, anything that's going to be you're going to come into contact on your skin, because the skin, it works 2 ways. It can absorb as well as it excrete. So anything that your body comes in contact with, you can absorb these chemicals.
Just with the laundry products, people use these dryer strips that have these fragrances. It's so I could walk down a trail and someone could be walking past me, and now of course they're all walking 10 feet away, but you still smell those laundry strips on them. I mean, it's just, imagine it's going into their body continuously. I mean, that's just one of the many things. I mean, people just poison themselves in every which way possible and don't even realize it,
No, those chemicals. No, I was going to say those fragrance chemicals are quite toxic. I think they're phthalates or parabens, but they are some of the worst. And you think, it makes it smell nice. Yeah, but it's really doing it's damaging your health. And I mean, we do cover that in the book.
I think there's I like these interesting little stories, because they're real life stories of what people experience. And people in America or worldwide may remember Liberace, the famous very flamboyant pianist who used to have all the fantastic sparkly rhinestone gear when he played the piano. And an interesting little story, because that he said himself, because he nearly died, which people may not be aware of. His kidneys were failing completely, and he was literally at death's door getting there, and they didn't realize what it was to start with. Again, cut a long story short, what it was is because after his performances each night, he obviously used to sweat a lot, and his clothes, his fancy uniforms, all went to the dry cleaners and came back. And they found what was happening is the cleaning products that were used to dry clean his clothes, because when he wore them each night, those chemicals soaked into his body through the skin, and they were shutting his kidneys down and very nearly killed him, until they realized what was happening. So that's the dangers just from having your clothes dry cleaned and not realizing just what chemicals your body's taking in. Very nearly killed him. So just another little interesting anecdote.
I think that's an organochlorine. Its short name is PERC. I can't remember the full name, but it's yes. I mean, organochlorine. I mean, that would be quite toxic. I don't know if it's the same used in dry cleaning everywhere. Anyway, so that's the second fact. I mean, it's much wider than all of that. I mean, but people do need to really, really take care about everything they put on or in their bodies.
So that's 2 of the 4 factors that we mentioned. Sorry, Bob, you wanted to come in?
I just wanted to add to that intake of toxins. Again, I mean, there's so much. I mean, what's in the air, what's in the water, the foods that we eat, all the chemicals, what people put into their bodies, cigarettes, alcohol, pharmaceutical drugs, over the counter and prescribed. I mean, so many people just pop Tylenols and Advils or whatever. I mean, like they're candy, any little ache or pain. I took a Tylenol, I took an Advil, I took an Excedrin. And then if that doesn't work, they go to the doctor and he gives them stronger pills. But I'm saying we are being bombarded by toxins on all levels and in so many different ways that people don't even, they don't even take into account how they're poisoning their body. So
no, but I mean,
so
no, I was going to say there are some.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say there are some that they can take control of, and because they're not all the toxins that you can be exposed to. You can do anything about.
Right,
But there are a lot you can, and
Right.
and they are some good examples of what people can stop poisoning themselves. You know, that they can, but they need to take responsibility for their own health, and they need to understand.
And we often point out, well, we do point out in the book as well, one of the problems that people don't realize is the combination of these chemicals, and particularly the drugs, as you mentioned, that you can buy over the counter or be prescribed by your doctors. None of them have tested very well, and they're certainly not tested in combination. So you can inadvertently have this drug and that drug, which may be reasonably okay on their own, but when you combine them, you've got something entirely different. And
Untested.
And those combinations are totally untested as to what they're going to do to your body. And the consequences of those things are quite dire sometimes, and can cause people to die, as well as just prolong the illness, for which the doctor will give them more and more medication. So you can end up with people's bathroom cabinet looks like a pharmaceutical shop, and they're taking one drug after another. And then they wonder why they eventually end up in hospital and die.
Exactly.
Slowly poisoned.
Exactly.
So anyway, so we've got two things. So we've got diet and toxic intake in all its many forms, which we do talk about in detail in the book. And then we've got electromagnetic radiation, which is a growing concern, I think, for everybody, because wherever you've got electrical devices, you've got electromagnetic radiation, electrical fields that are given out. So these are invisible. You can't smell them, you can't see them, but your body's affected by them. And of course, for you, Bob, being an acupuncturist, you know about the electrical system of the body. It's a very delicate system and much misunderstood by the mainstream medical establishment. It's taken them a long time to even realize that it exists. But it's a very subtle system, but very important. Without it, if it's not functioning properly, the body dies. Now, if people think about it, if you've got a very delicate electrical system in the body and you've got all these powerful electrical fields near to it, they're going to have an effect on it. That radiation, in the same way as if you have your radio playing and you set up an electric drill near it, for instance, and you get all this crackling and noise, well, that's electrical interference.
Right.
Well, the same thing happens to the body, but you just don't realize what's happening, and it can make people ill, either temporarily or permanently if it's prolonged.
Absolutely.
And of course, with cell phones and cell phone masts, power cables, transformers, all of the electrical equipment that we have in our houses now, and there is no way to hide from it, because they're putting more and more of the cell towers up. We've got people like Elon Musk launching more and more satellites every week, which are broadcasting microwave energy to all points of the earth. So very difficult. So it's a very worrying situation, but something people need to be aware of. There are things that people can do within their own home to minimize it, such as we always recommend never have electrical appliances in your bedroom when you're going to sleep at night. Certainly don't have your phone in there. You don't want your televisions on. You don't want any electrical stuff in your bedroom. If you can switch your Wi-Fi router off when you're not using it, do that. If you've got cordless telephones, I would recommend you get rid of them altogether, because I certainly did when I'm an electrical engineer, so I've got the meters to be able to test the electrical frequency and energies from things. And when I saw the amount of electrical energy coming from the base station of a cordless phone, I was horrified. And they went very quickly, got rid of those. So there are things you can do to minimize your exposure. And I recommend that people do so, because we found that particularly neurological diseases, say like multiple sclerosis, can be caused and certainly exacerbated by electromagnetic radiation. I mean, chemical damage too, but certainly electrical magnetic radiation. So that's the third factor. And then our final fourth factor was prolonged and excessive emotional stress. Stress is a real killer, and it can cause physical damage, not only from a mental state of depression, but also when you're in that state of consciousness, the body releases more free radicals. Free radicals being released in the body are natural things. It's a process that happens all the time. But in a healthy body, which has got the correct nutrition, they're flushed out in a normal way.
Mhm.
But if you don't have correct nutrition and you've got excessive free radicals, they're going to start causing tissue damage.
Mhm.
And if it's prolonged, they will cause organ damage,
Right.
so we can start getting into the realms of cancers and various tumors and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I would add that stress directly affects the function of the central nervous system, which affects its ability to coordinate and control the organs in the body. And one of the first things it affects is the muscular system. And so as things tighten up in the body when you're under stress, especially with the spine, it'll pull vertebrae out of place, which will mechanically affect the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. So what I'm saying is the effects of stress are so far reaching. It's not just chemical, it's electromagnetic, it's mechanical. And that's one of the biggest factors with most diseases that they call diseases like this current one, the COVID, is people are just so in fear and they're just panicked and financially they're stressed, emotionally, mentally. I mean, it's a combination of things, but the combination of factors, the stress that it creates and how it affects the body is probably one of the number one reasons why people will get sick in a situation like this.
Yeah, and I think the powers that be that are behind this, they know very well that, and that's why they keep changing the rules, which distresses people more. They put people under more and more pressure when they're losing their jobs. So tremendous, and of course in fear of a non-existent virus, that's going to kill them or their family.
But they have the test.
Tremendous pressure that people are put under, and I think it's deliberate because. So all of these things are going to make people more ill. So basically, those are our 4 factors, and we tested our own hypothesis whenever we came across a particular so-called disease to see whether we could find any other reason what might cause that disease. But always they boil down to one or more of those 4 factors. Never ever did it come to, we found a germ that caused it. And we found that this was to be true whether we're looking at so-called human diseases, and we also looked at animal diseases as well to see whether there was the same reasons, i.e. toxicity of one sort or another that the animals were subjected to that was actually causing the disease that they were supposed to have. And we found that the same applied. So there was not sort of one rule for humans and a different one for animals. It was exactly the same. Animals needed to be correctly fed, nutritious feed, and kept away from being overstressed, electromagnetic radiation, toxicity. It was exactly the same. And if you mess around with any of those 4 factors, the animals became sick. And one of the classic examples, particularly in the UK, which we often talk about, is what became known as mad cow disease in the UK. And when we looked into that, because it was obviously everyone was told there was some germ that was going to be making these cows appear to go mad and die. But what we actually found, long story short, is that the ministry and the government insisted that the cattle were dipped in what turned out to be organophosphates, which were supposed to kill off the warble flies that could damage the skins of the cows and make the hides less valuable. But the strength that was used in Britain, in the UK, was something like 4 times stronger than used anywhere else in the world. So that's why it became peculiar to the UK, because, as I said, organophosphates are a neurotoxin, and running that over the backs and the skins of the cows, it penetrated the skins, penetrated their nervous system, and disrupted it so much they appeared to go mad. Couldn't stand up and then were slaughtered. And thousands of herds were slaughtered in the UK. And the root cause was they were being poisoned with high-strength organophosphates, which, of course, to this day, the government has never admitted to for obvious reasons. But that was the actual cause.
Right. Well, and I wanted to add one more factor to your 4 factors, and maybe it's included in those. Sunshine, fresh air, and exercise, which is something when people are in lockdown, they don't get much of. So that's another factor.
Yeah. Yes, it's all part of healthy living. Yeah. I mean, again, there's a lot of nonsense going around at the moment of wanting to sort of artificially supplement, vitamin D, Well, as we know, the body makes vitamin D itself, but it requires, as you say, fresh air and sunshine, and it makes its own vitamin D. That's the way it works. You don't get it from going and taking a pill that you've bought from your local health shop. That's not the way to do it. Health is natural. Being naturally healthy, as we say, natural health is the gift for everyone. The rules are fairly simple, but they are fairly strict, and we've sort of just talked about them really. And you can't mess around with those rules. Stick to those rules. They don't cost lots of money. It's a natural way of living, and people will live a healthy and long life. It's as simple as that. If you resort to the doctors and chemical treatments, you'll have exactly the opposite. You'll have an unhealthy, shortened life. It's as simple as that.
And that's because the medical establishment thinks that, it sort of gives the impression that the human body is just kind of a bag of chemicals, and it can be fixed in different parts can be fixed in different places. But it actually is far more amazing than it's given credit for. It's interconnected. It's got the ability to protect itself, look after itself, heal itself. All these processes, like we were saying, the different symptoms are the body's efforts to expel the toxins, but also repair damage and restore health. I mean, the core, and I think it's, I can't remember his exact words, but Herbert Shelton says, the body, while it's alive, the body will continue to make every effort to be as healthy as possible. So all the sort of symptoms are the body's ways of trying to restore itself to health. But it's not given that credit as far as the medical establishment's concerned. And again, like Voltaire says, they don't understand the human body. It can't be bombarded, it can't be fixed by these sort of external chemicals. It needs to be looked after from the inside out, and the body will be healthy from the inside out. So that's why you've got to look after what you put into it. And also as well what you put onto it, because it'll be absorbed in. So the body is amazing.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to that. It is this inborn intelligence in your body that creates it from 2 cells and develops it and runs it, heals it all the time. It's working. And I was just going to add something about medical checkups, because so many people run to the doctor for their medical checkups. And what they're basing things on is what they call national averages. National average for blood pressures here, cholesterol's here, body temperatures here, and it's all based on averages, and averages of a society that's not so healthy to begin with. And then what happens is your body's maybe in a phase where it's doing something and it's interpreted as being out of balance, maybe very normal for you. But in any event, it could be something, and most likely it's something that's self-limiting, that your body will correct by itself. But if you run to the doctor and he sees it, he's going to put you on a drug and say, start taking this drug for your blood pressure or for your cholesterol. And then that's what starts things going, because then you start adding all these toxins in the system into a body that may be not all that healthy to begin with, or maybe very healthy actually, but it's not going to be healthy for long if you start taking these prescription drugs and over a long period of time, because they're just going to poison the body and create problems. Well, we see all the long list of side effects, and it's just amazing. So of course, I haven't been to a doctor in many, many years, actually since I was 18, except one time when I would call a chiropractor, because I hurt my back once when I was shoveling gravel back a few years ago. So if you call that a visit to the doctor, but otherwise, I haven't had checkups since I was 18. And God only knows, I'll be 70 in October, and at some point I'm going to die, and I'll die of something. But the point is, I haven't taken any prescription drugs, and I haven't been to a doctor, and I feel pretty darn good, actually. I can outrun many people half my age.
I'm sure. And pretty much, same for us. I'm a little bit older than you, and Dawn's quite a bit younger than me, but so I'll be 71 actually in November this year. So so I think we're living examples of a plant-based diet. Is very healthy, and I think because we've been on it for so long, if there was something wrong with it, we'd have been very ill and probably dead a long time ago. So as I say, it's quite obvious if people look into it that the plant-based diet, vegan diet, is very healthy, and the best way to live. And it's a simple diet, really, and it isn't boring. You know, there's people just think, oh, what do you do? Do you just live on lettuce and, you know, carrots and things like that? Is that all you've got? That I say, well, look, you know, just look into a little bit. There's lots of vegan cookbooks now that you can look at, and you'll see there's lots of tasty meals that you can cook if that's what you want to do, and all made from good produce. Make sure your basic produce is good, and you'll have really interesting meals, anything you like. So it doesn't have to be boring.
Try to eat more raw foods, because when you cook food, you destroy a lot of the nutrients.
True.
Yes, but when people are working their way towards, yes, I mean, if you know, if they're eating a bad diet, they need to work their way towards it. So yes, if possible. I mean, some people can just say, okay, well, I'll stop eating that and I'll do that. I mean, yes, raw where you can. I mean, certain vegetables maybe should be cooked. I think,
right, of course,
potatoes. So, but
raw. You're absolutely right, Bob. I mean, raw food is best. That's where you're going to get the maximum amount of nutrients from it. The more you cook it, the less there are left in it, you know.
Right.
It's as simple as that.
But if you're going to have sorry, go on.
That's why I suggest in the transition, juicing is good, because people can get a lot of raw nutrition in their body while they're still eating a lot of their cooked foods, and at least get those enzymes and that raw nutrition into their body. Yeah.
So it's different things for different people. Of how to get to that goal that we're recommending is to get onto a full plant-based vegan diet. And yes, people will choose a different route to get there, but we recommend they do get there, and as soon as possible. And you know, if they need any more convincing, I do recommend that they watch that the Game Changers video, and it is pretty convincing, because they're all top athletes, all who've had their performance improved by going onto a vegan diet. They've not become weak and feeble, they've just reversed. So
yes, I mean, you just have to look at some of them and you think, no, they are not weak, feeble, you know, because some people say, oh, well, you know, that's the other thing, oh, where do you get your protein? I mean, there are so many myths about what an adult body requires in turn, and they say, you know, you need a certain amount of vitamins and minerals, but this again, it sows confusion, because the actual plants provide all of the nutrients in exactly the right balance. So that's why, again, having a variety of different plant foods, whether we call them fruits or vegetables, although most vegetables are the fruits of certain plants, but so they'll give you a whole range of nutrients, and a whole load of nutrients that nobody's ever actually analysed or discovered or labelled or named. So but that's why whole food wherever possible. So yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's just some people kind of want a sort of a step-by-step guide of how to get into that. But the one thing is to try and keep away from processed food products, and certainly not these vegan kind of meat substitute type things, because they will be almost entirely chemicals. There'll be very little in the way of actual produce or product, anything real in the way of food in there, and that's the idea. It's a bandwagon for these businesses, these companies to jump into to make lots of money, because it seems to be a fad. And so the idea is, no, it's a whole food plant-based diet, and that's really the key.
And raw as much as possible.
And yes, so maybe even not necessarily saying kind of vegan, but I mean, there are different ways of interpreting, but it's a question of looking at the food you eat, and not everyone can necessarily afford sort of organic produce. But at the same time, but at the same time, you say, well, what price your health? How much do you value your own health? So people have to look at these things now, and probably more than ever, with what's going on, and certainly to get out of the fear. This fear-based, the fear-based propaganda is really doing a lot of damage mentally, because again, like we were talking about placebo and nocebo, that once people get the idea that there's something that be passed around, and you can see as you walk around, people kind of doing this and sort of moving away from you. You think, why you know, why? What makes you think I'm ill? You know, do I look? You know, it's bizarre. But anyway, so yeah, so I mean that's really
another little interesting thing, just on a lighter note, which people will see if they watch that video that I keep plugging. I really ought to get a commission for it, I think. There's the guy who's the strongest man in the world, great huge guy, lifting weights, and he said people say to him, how, and he's obviously a vegan, and they said, how can you, he said, you're as strong as an ox. How can you be as strong as an ox based on plants? And he said, have you ever seen an ox eat meat? I just killed the conversation. I thought, well, he's correct, you know, absolutely correct. But yeah, I recommend it. It'll convince a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, there are a lot of other videos on Netflix too that show how people, like I said, cure themselves of many different chronic illnesses by going on a plant-based diet, juicing, etc., fasting. So there's a lot of information out there. People can improve their health without drugs. Well, they're not going to get their health improved with drugs, that's for certain. But definitely by making these changes in their lifestyle, the diet, fresh air, exercise, sunshine, meditation, anything that promotes, you know, the body's, you know, system, promotes health in the body, which, like I said, all these things do. And it's a matter of changing your lifestyle completely. And it doesn't have to happen overnight, like Dawn said. We can do it in baby steps.
Yeah.
Because for most people, it's pretty radical, and they just can't do it overnight. So you do it step by step, you know.
Okay.
And well, as you say, as well as the videos, there's plenty of literature out there. You know,
they could start with our book.
Well, that's number one. Absolutely.
And we've got plenty of books that we've got in, you know, referred to in there that, you know, they can go to for even more information. Some of them available online. So, you know,
there's 40 pages of references in the book. So people can check up where we've got our information from, and they can probably get some of those books themselves if they want to do further research. They can even start by our website. If they go to our website at...
what is your website? Give me your website. Your website.
Yeah, if they go to whatreallymakesyouill.com.
That's it.
And, you know, there's lots of free information on there. There's videos that we've done, interviews like this, so they can hear what we've got to say. There's articles that get put up there. So there's, you know, we keep updating it. So there's a lot of free information that people can get, and hopefully they will buy the book, or at least get the Kindle version, which is obviously much cheaper. And you know, they can benefit from the 10 years we took to really put all the facts and figures down there. And we've tried to make it a nice, easy read, and like a detective story. I know people are tempted to jump about in it, but we do recommend start at the beginning and read through, because it's like a detective story. It builds the evidence so that when you get to the end, you can see why the result is what we say it is. And we think people, well, we know from the feedback that we get from people who have bought the book, and we're talking thousands, I'm happy to say, that it's been very helpful to them, and we get lots of good feedback that it does help them and changes their whole outlook on health and what to do about it. So we know it works. So I'm pleased about that.
Great. Well, that wraps it up. I think you covered everything, and I think it was a great interview and a lot of good information. And I hope people watch this once, twice, 3 times so they can get everything, because there's a lot to get, and take it to heart.
Yeah. Okay, Bob. Well, thank you very much for having us on. And yeah, like you, I hope that people will take note, and it's in their own interest. You know, that's what we do this for. Take back control of your health. You know, you can do it. Never too late to start, and you'll feel much better for it. Okay.
Well, great talking with you guys, and let's do this again soon.
Yes, we'll do.
Thank you, Bob.
Right. Sure. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.